5 years after opening its singular glass eye to the great unknown cosmos, humanity instructed its most expensive machine to perform a seemingly foolish task. We commanded the orbital machine to stare into a completely empty, dark and void patch of sky near the constellation of Ursa Major. For 10 unbroken days the machine gazed into absolute nothingness, capturing 342 images across the ultraviolet, visible and infrared light spectrums. When the data was finally compiled, it did not reveal an empty void. Instead, it revealed a sprawling, chaotic and beautiful sea of galaxies stretching backward across time to their very origins. In that single, breathtaking image, humanity glimpsed the true, terrifying scale of the cosmos for the very first time. Welcome, fellow travellers, to This is Space. I am your narrator, Christopher, and today we are embarking on a magnificent journey through the history of human vision, exploring how our understanding of reality expanded from a tiny, flat landscape into an infinite ocean of stars. Before we dive deep into the mysteries of the universe, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the vastness of the universe. Your support helps us continue bringing the wonders of the cosmos directly to your screen. For thousands of years, humanity looked up at the night sky in pure wonder. However, with only the fragile human eye to observe the immense dark expanse, our perception of the heavens was deeply flawed and fundamentally limited. When ancient people looked into the night sky, they saw that the stars were arranged in a fixed, or unmoving pattern that simply rotated around the observer on the ground. The great thinker Aristotle emerged as perhaps the most prominent voice of early Greek philosophy, and he coined the phrase regarding the immutable heavens. He believed this was a realm where absolutely nothing would ever change, a perfect sphere of divine permanence. Naturally, many of the ancient scholars pictured a geocentric universe. In this comfortable vision of reality, our home planet rested firmly at the centre of everything, while the celestial bodies danced in perfect eternal orbit around us. But not all early thinkers agreed with this comforting illusion. In ancient Greece, a visionary named Aristarchus had bravely suggested that perhaps our world might not be at the centre of the universe at all. He proposed a radical idea that maybe the radiant sun might be resting at the centre of the cosmic stage. Yet, his voice was lost to the prevailing dogmas of his era. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, astronomers had devised a highly complex mathematical model to explain the strange and complex movements of the planets that the naked eye could observe. Occasionally, but with strict regularity, the path of each wandering planet would briefly appear to move backwards against the backdrop of fixed stars. With our home planet fixed rigidly as the centre of reality, these strange retrograde motions were explained away by adding bizarre loops called epicycles to the orbits of the planets. All of astronomy was entirely fixated on the strict concept that the circle is a perfect geometric figure. In order to keep circles as the fundamental way that things moved in the universe, they were forced to invent a system of little circles orbiting around bigger circles. It was a beautiful, dizzying, and completely incorrect mechanical clockwork. Several bright minds would question this rigid paradigm over the centuries that followed. Then, in the 1500s, a brilliant Polish canon sparked the great heliocentric revolution. Nicholas Copernicus realized with stunning clarity that the motions of the planets we could see in the sky would be much more elegantly explained if they were all moving around the sun, instead of moving around the observer on the ground. Copernicus was able to dramatically simplify the ancient picture and remove many of those confusing epicycles. However, it turns out in the end that his perfectly circular orbits were not exactly the final solution to the cosmic puzzle. At the dramatic turn of the 17th century, the brilliant German astronomer Johannes Kepler did away with circular orbits and epicycles entirely. Through painstaking observation and mathematical genius, Kepler allowed each planet to orbit in a slightly imperfect, elongated ellipse around the blazing sun. Suddenly, humanity had a very simple, direct, and incredibly clean model for how the solar system actually worked, a model that finally mapped perfectly with the physical reality of the heavens. The universe was slowly opening its doors to human comprehension. Just a few short years after Kepler reshaped our understanding of planetary motion, humanity acquired clear, undeniable scientific evidence that our home world was not the centre of the universe. This profound paradigm shift happened thanks to a few pieces of precisely shaped glass, The truth is that astronomy is only ever as good as the instruments you have at your disposal. The magnificent invention of the telescope in the year 1608 completely revealed the hidden heavens. Before the very first telescopes were developed and refined, human beings could only see about 3,000 individual stars with the naked eye. When people first started looking at the night sky through these new optical tubes, it marked the very first time a human sense had been mechanically extended beyond its natural biological limits. The telescope is a remarkably simple invention at its core. Suddenly, an observer could collect far more light than the human pupil could gather alone, and still direct that massive amount of ancient starlight directly into a human eye. It simply uses a couple of curved lenses, you put them together in a tube, and you can drastically magnify the distant objects that you're looking at in the dark. Because of this invention, astronomers could suddenly stop building all of astronomy around just tiny, blurry points of light in the sky, which is what the entire science had been entirely based upon before that moment. The legendary Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei was the first person on historical record to boldly point his rudimentary telescope skyward. Looking through his primitive lenses, he was able to clearly make out the dramatically cratered and mountainous surface of the moon, and he illustrated its changing phases in rigorous detail. Galileo then trained his magnificent sights on the glowing planet Venus, and discovered that it too went through distinct phases, perfectly mimicking the phases of our own moon. He showed the world that the glowing band known as the Milky Way was basically made up of countless individual stars, rather than some sort of mysterious coagulated cosmic milk as the ancients had believed. But perhaps his greatest and most world-shattering discovery came as he carefully observed the giant gas planet Jupiter. As he was looking through his long tube of glass, he saw what he initially thought were 4 tiny stars hovering very close around Jupiter. He kept watching those tiny points of light over the course of a few consecutive days, and he saw those mysterious stars rotating around the giant planet. He proudly published this massive discovery as the moons of Jupiter. This single observation completely shattered the concept in the minds of astronomers that everything in reality needed to orbit the ground we walk upon. Telescopic sight had successfully revealed a distant, massive world with its own orbiting satellites. However, the unique ability of the telescope to open up the deep secrets of our universe had only just begun its long journey. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the history of cosmic discovery, please do not forget to subscribe to This Is Space, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Engaging with our videos helps us grow and allows us to bring you more incredible documentaries about the vast unknown. A dark night in the wilderness reveals that the glowing stars are not simply randomly sprinkled across our immense sky. Most of the stellar bodies collect in a remarkably long, dense trail, sweeping beautifully through the dark heavens. This famous milky path that stretches across the night sky, which the ancient Romans poetically called the Path of Milk, is what we call today the Milky Way galaxy. It is an absolutely amazing sight to behold, but with the naked eye, you absolutely cannot distinguish all of the individual stars that create the glow. The Milky Way is really a massive collection of many billions of stars, which are individually too incredibly small and too distant to be seen without mechanical aid. While the lenses of Galileo revealed the individual stars of the galactic plane, the true structural significance of the Milky Way would not become clear until the late 18th century. The deeply dedicated brother and sister team of William and Carolyn Herschel relentlessly constructed some of the absolute largest telescopes in the entire world. There are fundamentally different types of telescopes. Either you can use lenses, which are made of polished glass, and you pass the starlight directly through the glass. These devices are called refractive telescopes. There was a natural physical limit to exactly how large you could possibly make these specific telescopes based on glass lenses. When you try to make a glass lens larger and larger, it inevitably becomes incredibly heavy. That massive piece of glass literally bends under its own immense weight, and as it warps, it loses the perfect optical shape to which it has been carefully manufactured. To solve this engineering crisis, in the year 1789, the Herschel family completed the biggest telescope in the world, measuring a staggering 12 meters in length. This great 40-foot telescope captured ancient light not with heavy glass lenses, but with giant polished metal mirrors. Engineers could make mirrors much larger without facing severe structural problems, because you could easily put a massive piece of steel underneath the mirror that would firmly hold it in its proper place. That support structure was structurally much stiffer than a suspended glass lens would ever possibly be. Furthermore, mirrors do not suffer from some of the annoying optical problems, or what optical engineers call chromatic aberrations, that traditional glass lenses constantly do. In the 1780s, William Herschel and his dedicated sister embarked on a mind-bending project to visually map the entire Milky Way. Conceptually, it is quite difficult these days to truly think about just what an insane endeavour this actually was. These were two people standing in the cold, looking out into the dark with a very large metal telescope that they had built entirely themselves, attempting the impossible task of mapping a giant forest, while standing directly within the centre of that very forest. When you're inside the trees, you do not really know what the entire forest looks like from the outside. They carefully measured the relative distances to what they called cloudy nebulae at the time. What they found was that these fuzzy patches of light were actually usually massive clusters of distant stars. Herschel incorrectly assumed that every single star in the cosmos would naturally have the exact same sort of true base brightness, emitting the exact same amount of fundamental light. So, he logically figured that if he simply looked into all directions in the night sky and painstakingly counted exactly how many stars he saw there, he could mathematically work out the entire structure of the Milky Way and that overall geometric distribution of stars. It was not a completely correct scientific assumption, but it was not a totally bad one either. Scientists, when standing directly in the face of a complete lack of knowledge and a deep lack of understanding, have to boldly start somewhere. By knowing the exact mathematical point at which their giant telescope was pointed, and calculating the distance of a star based entirely on how dim it appeared to their eyes, the sibling teams slowly mapped the overarching structure of our home galaxy. They brilliantly discovered that the Milky Way is shaped exactly like a flattened geometric disk, and that the stars were not distributed uniformly across the whole volume of the sky. In spite of their incredibly hard work and sleepless nights, the pair incorrectly concluded that our solar system was located directly near the dead centre of the Milky Way. Their sample size of visible stars was far too limited by their environment. The Milky Way consists of much more material than just glowing stars. There are massive, sprawling heaps of dark cosmic dust clouds floating in the void. These colossal clouds are so thick and so incredibly dense that they completely obscure the travelling light from the stars shining behind them. The dedicated siblings were tragically limited by the most nearby dark dust clouds completely surrounding our solar system, and that barrier defined exactly how far they could physically see. It would take over an entire century of technological advancement to correctly reposition our cosmic home. As the dawn of the 20th century arrived, the next major record-setting telescope was finally completed in the mountains. Imagine 22 tons of intricate moving parts, all flawlessly supported by a perfectly balanced pool of liquid mercury, designed specifically to turn a gigantic glass mirror toward its celestial targets in the sky. The massive gathering power of the 60-inch telescope located in Southern California allowed the brilliant astronomer Harlow Shapley to actively embark on his detailed study of ancient globular clusters. These objects are incredibly tightly bound collections of ancient stars that originally evolved together from the exact same primordial gas cloud. You might easily think about a globular cluster like a gigantic glowing spherical ball containing tens of thousands, or perhaps even hundreds of thousands, of ancient stars burning fiercely together. Crucially, these massive clusters are not hidden within the dusty, flat plane of the Milky Way, but rather they form a massive halo sphere all around the galactic centre. An astronomer can clearly see these bright clusters hovering far above the dusty plane of the Milky Way. And far below the dusty plane of the Milky Way, located perfectly in the empty void where there is absolutely no cosmic dust in the way to block the view of the observer, Shapley cleverly employed a very specific, strange breed of star found deep within these ancient clusters to accurately determine their true distance from the planet Earth. It is really incredibly hard to measure vast distances in the vacuum of space, because scientists cannot just simply get a gigantic ruler and place it straight between the glowing stars. Yet measuring distance is a really important foundational part of what astronomers must do. One of the absolute best ways to discover exactly how far away distant objects truly are is to carefully look at a very specific type of pulsating star called a Cepheid variable. Behaving exactly like a piece of brilliant cosmic clockwork, these strange stars vary their total brightness over a specific period of time. It is a highly stable, completely predictable pulsation, where each pulse of light might last for exactly a week, or perhaps even up to an entire month. Shapley mathematically knew that he could perfectly time those specific pulsations and directly derive the true absolute brightness of the star. So, an astronomer can take the Cepheid variable star, place it extremely far away in the dark universe, and obviously the visible light gets much dimmer to our eyes. But because we know what the true absolute brightness is, simply because we know precisely how rapidly it is pulsating, the apparent dimness tells us the exact mathematical distance across the void. By carefully calculating the massive distance of countless Cepheid variables, Shapley definitively revealed that just as our blue planet is not the centre of our local solar system is absolutely not at the centre of the giant Milky Way galaxy. We now know as a hard scientific fact that the solar system is actually far closer to the desolate edge of our galaxy than to the busy centre. We sit floating in the quiet suburbs, about 25,000 light-years away from the chaotic, swirling centre of the galaxy. In the year 1917, the massive 60-inch telescope resting at Mount Wilson was completely surpassed by an even larger, more powerful device constructed at the exact same high-altitude site. Weighing well over 4 tons, the incredible mirror of the 100-inch Hooker telescope was bizarrely forged from thousands of melted green wine bottles, which were then flawlessly coated in highly reflective silver. The famous American astronomer Edwin Hubble was proudly offered a permanent staff position at this magnificent observatory, and very soon set his mind to work studying the mysterious spiral nebulae scattered across the dark sky. There was a massive, heated debate raging among astronomers about the true fundamental nature of these glowing nebulae. One loud part of the scientific community confidently said they are just small glowing clouds of gas floating nearby. The other side of the loud debate passionately argued that we think some of them might actually be entire distant Milky Ways, completely separate, massive island universes floating alone in the absolute dark. To definitively settle the raging debate, Edwin Hubble attempted to mathematically measure their true distances from the planet Earth. He deeply suspected they were floating far outside our local galaxy, but many other highly respected astronomers strongly thought they were simply trapped within our own local galaxy. On a cold, dark night in October of 1923, while meticulously comparing separate photographic glass plates of the famous Andromeda Nebula, Hubble incredibly identified the faint rhythmic pulse of a Cepheid variable star. His complex mathematical calculations definitively showed that the pulsing star was roughly 900,000 light-years away from our eyes. This incredible distance was located far beyond where Shapley had accurately placed the absolute outer edge of the Milky Way. It meant, without any shadow of a doubt, that Andromeda could not possibly be a part of our own local galaxy. It fundamentally had to be a completely separate, massive galaxy, a totally separate island universe filled with its own billions of blazing stars. This was the exact paradigm-shifting moment when the Andromeda Nebula officially became the Andromeda Galaxy. We suddenly realized we were no longer the center of absolutely everything. The understood universe suddenly and violently expanded, becoming this impossibly vast place completely populated by countless other massive galaxies exactly like our own home. The brilliant follow-up astronomical discoveries of Hubble swiftly convinced the great majority of the scientific community that the wider universe contained a massive, staggering myriad of independent galaxies, perhaps numbering as many as 100 billion individual galactic systems. The entire universe was suddenly revealed to be far, far bigger than the human mind could have possibly ever imagined in its wildest dreams. Every single major astronomical discovery we have ever made as a species has fundamentally changed the way we view ourselves in direct relation to this vast universe. With every century, we literally become a much smaller physical part of the whole. We become a much less privileged part of the grand design. We are sitting on a tiny wet piece of rock that is endlessly orbiting a very, very average, completely ordinary star. And that seemingly special star is just one single light, among roughly 200 billion others, all endlessly orbiting the center of a pretty ordinary standard spiral galaxy. And that home galaxy is just sitting in a local group of about 50 other galaxies, floating within a giant supercluster containing probably millions of other galaxies, resting in a cold universe that is unimaginably big and quite possibly completely infinite in its boundless scope. Before we explore the invisible forces of the cosmos, please subscribe to the channel. Leaving a comment and joining our community of space explorers truly helps. This is Space deliver the highest quality cosmic documentaries directly to you, but to truly, completely explore the depths of the universe, we had to find a way to see the totally invisible. Before the arrival of the 19th century, the view humanity held of the physical world was heavily restricted by biological evolution to the narrow visible light spectrum. Then, in the year 1800, the brilliant astronomer William Herschel, the exact same man who had bravely attempted to map the position of our blazing sun within the entire cosmos, accidentally exposed the greatest hidden secret of sunlight. Herschel was well aware that Isaac Newton had famously split the white light of the sun into a beautiful separated rainbow of colours using a simple glass prism. Herschel then began to wonder exactly what might happen just beyond the visual edge of that colourful rainbow. He was deeply interested in what specific thermal temperatures the different colours of the separated rainbow might naturally possess. But then, acting out of pure scientific curiosity, he carefully moved one of his delicate glass thermometers slightly beyond the glowing red edge of the visual spectrum. To his absolute shock, he brilliantly discovered that the invisible temperature sitting there in the dark was actually much higher than even the extremely hot red end of the visible spectrum. That staggering measurement definitively told him that there was absolutely some invisible form of active radiation moving through the air, which may have been very similar to the known radiation of visible light, but it uniquely carried with it a massive amount of physical heat. That simple thermometer experiment was actually the grand discovery of invisible infrared radiation. He boldly went on to be able to physically show that these invisible infrared rays were the exact same fundamental kinds of energy rays as the visible light we see. They were easily reflected by shiny mirrors and perfectly refracted by glass lenses. These massive, powerful rays of invisible energy constantly traverse and disperse across the cold vacuum of deep space. But the truth is, they are merely two small specific sections of a continuous, massive spectrum of energy, stretching from low-energy radio waves at the absolute bottom, all the way to violent, terrifying gamma rays at the absolute greatest energy extreme. And that single, elegant discovery really set the perfect stage for a detailed, rich understanding of the much broader, completely invisible electromagnetic spectrum. Working astronomers were historically very slow to adopt the complex technology capable of detecting these hidden energy rays. But following rapid, desperate technological developments, heavily spurred on by the global conflict of the Second World War, the entirely new field of infrared astronomy beautifully blossomed into reality. Although we cannot see this hidden infrared light with our weak biological eyes, our modern technological detectors and advanced digital cameras attached to the massive telescopes can actually capture and translate that invisible ancient light. Infrared astronomy was a massive world-changing scientific breakthrough, specifically because it finally allowed us to see clearly right through the massive dark clouds of cosmic dust. The incredibly chaotic star-forming regions scattered throughout the galaxy, where completely young, violent stars are just forming their cores, are heavily engulfed and totally hidden in thick interstellar dust. When we use advanced infrared light sensors, we are looking right through the blocking dust, which is remarkably completely transparent to the infrared wavelength, and we can finally see exactly how the giant stars are being violently assembled in the dark. We can visually observe exactly how the giant gas spheres are physically growing in mass. We had absolutely never been able to clearly watch true infant stars burning in the dark before the incredible advent of infrared thermal imaging. Slowly, the entire massive electromagnetic spectrum eventually became completely technologically accessible to our machines. With each new energy band we unlocked, the universe began revealing completely different, or previously unimaginable secrets of the cosmic dark. Our biological eyes simply evolved on the planes to detect only visible light, because that was useful for our basic survival, but that is really only a tiny, insignificant fraction of the whole, flowing electromagnetic spectrum. When we are looking at the sky using ultraviolet sensors, we're actually looking directly at the hottest stars and the absolute most violent, hottest gas in the galaxy. Conversely, when we are looking at the sky using massive radio wave dishes, we are looking directly at the absolute coldest, most ancient gas floating silently in the universe. Yet, each specific band of electromagnetic radiation is uniquely, incredibly challenging to properly study from the ground. Even capturing basic visible light is a massive struggle. As our giant ground telescopes are constantly hindered by the very atmospheric air, humanity desperately needs to simply survive. Standing on the solid surface of the Earth, we are very, very fortunate to have a thick protective atmosphere to breathe. However, for dedicated astronomers trying to look out into the dark, that thick air is fundamentally a massive obstacle. As the ancient light travels endlessly from a distant star, it is travelling flawlessly in a perfectly straight line through the absolute vacuum of space. But then, in the final microsecond of its epic journey, it violently hits our thick atmosphere and gets severely perturbed and bent through the turbulent air currents. This optical turbulence is the exact reason why distant stars appear to beautifully twinkle to our naked eyes. If you try to take a highly magnified telescopic image of that twinkling star, the photograph just comes out completely blurred and practically useless for deep scientific study. In order to drastically limit the total physical volume of chaotic atmosphere that we need to peer through, the absolute largest, most expensive optical telescopes in the entire world tend to be built directly on the peaks of the absolute tallest, most desolate mountains on the planet. Today, incredibly clever astronomers and dedicated optical engineers actively combat this atmospheric visual distortion with a stunning piece of modern technology, broadly known as adaptive optics. Adaptive optics is a brilliant theoretical technique that was initially proposed way back in the year 1953. At that specific time in history, the necessary computing technology just was not there to actually physically implement his wild idea. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, brilliant people started seriously thinking about exactly how they could do that with modern computers. To successfully counteract the atmospheric distortion, astronomers shoot incredibly powerful, bright lasers directly up into the dark night sky. They use a fascinating technique called laser guide stars. What you do is you powerfully propagate a tuned laser beam high into the night sky, and you literally create an artificial, glowing star with the intense beam of light. The powerful laser strikes a thin layer of naturally occurring sodium atoms floating on the extreme upper edge of the atmosphere, causing those specific atoms to brightly glow in the dark. The resulting light then travels rapidly back down through the swirling, turbulent air, and the massive telescope receives this artificial point of reference. Incredibly fast supercomputers constantly analyze the heavily distorted shape of the artificial star and instantly create an exact inverse mathematical pattern. That incredibly complex digital pattern is sent directly to a highly advanced deformable mirror, which constantly uses tiny, powerful magnets to physically bend its own glass surface into complex shapes. The engineers actively push and pull on the back surface of the glass with hundreds of little robotic actuators. It acts exactly like a mechanical bed of nails, and the actuators act like tiny, rapid fingers which can instantly move and physically distort the glass surface in a way which perfectly compensates for the optical errors introduced by the swirling atmosphere. Because the changing temperature particles in the atmosphere are constantly shifting and moving with the wind, these brilliant adaptive mirrors have to mechanically adjust their surface shape in real time, executing up to a staggering 1,000 microscopic movements every single second. Through this mechanical dance, the atmospheric distortion is completely cancelled out, perfectly revealing exactly how the ancient heavens appear before the light ever entered the turbulent air of the planet Earth. And sometimes, you absolutely cannot even mathematically tell the difference between the stunning images that have been captured on the ground with these adaptive optics and those pristine images that have been captured directly in the vacuum of space, far above the atmosphere entirely. In the year 1995, this magical technology directly enabled the glorious discovery of the very first known brown dwarf, effectively proving the missing cosmic link between the absolute largest gas giant planets and the absolute smallest burning stars. Furthermore, By carefully resolving individual stars and meticulously tracking their chaotic, swirling motions at the dead center of the Milky Way galaxy, adaptive optics was also successfully employed to definitively identify the terrifying presence of a supermassive black hole hiding in the dark. But to truly, completely unlock the deepest secrets of the heavens, we would ultimately have to physically journey to them. Our thick atmosphere not only continuously distorts incoming images, it also permanently prevents some extremely important types of light from ever reaching our mechanical eyes on the ground. We managed to do some absolutely amazing, groundbreaking observations of the deep universe from the ground where we occasionally can, but the brutal reality is that the atmosphere of the Earth completely blocks entirely critical cosmic wavelengths. Very high energy gamma rays, deep infrared heat, and extreme ultraviolet radiation are completely absorbed by the sky. The optical view from the surface of the planet Earth is totally insufficient if we truly hope to deeply understand the universe. It is kind of like if a medical doctor was trying to diagnose your illness, and he only ever looked at one tiny part of your physical body, instead of examining your whole overarching health. The ultimate engineering solution to this problem would be incredibly difficult, massively expensive, but absolutely necessary for human progress. We definitively needed to deliver a massive telescope directly into the freezing vacuum of space. The heavy metallic body of the more than 2-ton orbiting astronomical observatory spacecraft became the heaviest unmanned scientific satellite created by humanity at that time. The engineers designed it to carry 9 different telescopes into the void. Once we had successfully sent the very first mechanical satellites into a stable orbit around the Earth, we finally had the real, tangible possibility of escaping that suffocating atmosphere forever and sending advanced observatories and delicate instruments far out into space to silently gather pristine data without ever having to look through the turbulent air of the planet. On a freezing day on December the 7th in the year 1968, just 3 short weeks before the dramatic first crewed human flight around the rocky moon, an incredibly powerful Atlas Centaur rocket successfully carried the very first operational space telescope safely into the dark vacuum of orbit. This orbiting astronomical observatory number 2 proudly earned the romantic moniker Stargazer. It was successfully put up into the dark by the space agency, and it was a highly advanced ultraviolet telescope. What the Stargazer machine did was it silently looked at many distant stars, and the raw data it gathered actually proved to us that many stars are significantly hotter and more violent than the mathematical models on the ground had been incorrectly predicting they were. Astronomers had very long believed that completely new stars are slowly formed by the gradual gentle condensation of cold interstellar gas and floating dust. But with the incredible data from the observatory, we were able to significantly better understand the incredibly violent and chaotic process of early star formation. The silent orbital observatory also definitively confirmed that ancient comets plunging through our solar system are actually entirely surrounded by vast glowing clouds of invisible hydrogen gas. But absolutely most importantly of all, the Stargazer satellite definitively proved the long-term engineering viability of maintaining an advanced, delicate observatory in the freezing vacuum of orbit. With each subsequent passing decade, entirely new, much more advanced telescopes were strapped to massive rockets and violently carried to the heavens, slowly opening up the entire invisible electromagnetic spectrum to human eyes. It is a simple fact of physics that absolutely everything resting on the Earth constantly emits infrared thermal radiation. Our warm human bodies do, the rocky Earth does, the thick atmosphere does, entirely because it is all constantly being intensely heated by the blazing rays of our sun, and so, we often have to completely remove our highly sensitive infrared telescopes from the planet and get them far out into the freezing void of deep space just to function properly. The incredibly advanced infrared astronomical satellite, which was a massive joint engineering project organized between the United States, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, brilliantly launched into the dark sky in the year 1983. It provided an entirely new, glorious window into deep, astronomical observations and a beautiful opportunity to definitively learn entirely new scientific facts about the ancient stars. The truth of science is that every single time we do a brand new deep survey of the sky, at a completely new wavelength of light, we absolutely always find massive paradigm-shifting discoveries. And incredibly, Those shocking discoveries are almost never exactly what we had originally intended to find in the first place. Over its historic 10-month orbital mission, the satellite flawlessly mapped a staggering 96% of the entire night sky. Its powerful sensors pierced right through the thick dust of dying stars that had just violently erupted, and it clearly revealed the hidden Magellanic Clouds, which are two massive satellite galaxies closely orbiting our own Milky Way, located a staggering 190,000 light-years away from our eyes. But humanity can proudly boast that our absolute longest-serving, most successful infrared space telescope to date is the legendary Spitzer Space Telescope. Launched dramatically into the dark in August of the year 2003, the Spitzer machine officially entered active scientific service as that year slowly came to a quiet close. Spitzer was completely unique because it was the very first massive telescope intentionally placed in a strange, slow, Earth-trailing orbit. It is continuously circling the blazing sun at the exact same relative distance as our planet Earth, but it is slowly and intentionally drifting further and further away from the planet over the passage of time. This brilliant orbital trajectory heavily allows the fragile instrument to stay much, much colder, largely because it absolutely does not have to deal with the intense blinding thermal glow constantly emanating from the warm Earth itself. And by carefully keeping the delicate instrument far colder than the surrounding void, you really heavily reduce the annoying background thermal noise, and you can easily see much fainter, much older signals travelling from the edge of time. By silently peering right through the thick solar dust, Spitzer incredibly revealed the hidden outermost ring of Saturn, known as the Phoebe Ring, which massively starts about 6 million kilometres beyond the giant gas planet itself. It also brilliantly revealed the dark, hidden cosmic cradles of absolutely newborn stars, and it managed to capture the faint thermal glow of some of the absolute most distant, terrifying black holes currently known in the entire visible universe. Even when its vital liquid helium chemical coolant inevitably completely ran out in the year 2009, its incredible mission miraculously continued. The dedicated Spitzer engineering team looked at the data, turned around, and boldly said they could still successfully operate the machine at some of the shorter wavelengths, confidently stating they absolutely did not need the chemical coolant for that specific task. And remarkably, some of the absolute most amazing, groundbreaking stuff that Spitzer has ever successfully done in those unexpected latter years were absolutely never confidently predicted by engineers in the early beginning of its original mission. It remained so incredibly scientifically productive right up until the very bitter end. After a glorious career in the dark, Spitzer was finally officially decommissioned and put to sleep in January of the year 2020, a full 16 years after it very first opened its cold infrared eye to the universe. However, the absolute reigning juggernaut of massive space public relations, the ultimate tool of public scientific outreach, and the greatest gleaming monument to the exploration of humanity, continues to successfully operate today, the legendary Hubble Space Telescope. Hubble really heavily capitalized on some of the earlier engineering developments heavily tested with the earlier space telescopes. Scientists boldly promised that with the new massive mirror, we would be able to look out to much greater distances across the dark, and therefore we could look much further backward into the depths of time itself, getting much closer to the literal fiery creation of the universe itself. On an unforgettable day on April 24th in the year 1990, the massive space shuttle Discovery roared into the sky, and carrying the giant Hubble machine to its dark home in Earth orbit. The glorious liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery, carrying the precious Hubble Space Telescope in its massive cargo bay, completely opened our ultimate window on the universe. One short month later, after checking its complex systems, Hubble was finally ready to officially begin its historic mission of discovery. The engineers carefully commanded the massive machine to take its very first images of the stars. But when the highly anticipated first images were slowly downloaded to the anxious computers on the ground, something was horribly, terribly wrong. Absolutely everyone in the control room was really severely surprised and deeply shocked. The optical image quality absolutely was not what they were excitedly expecting at all. The stars were completely fuzzed out and terribly blurred in a catastrophic way that really had not been actively anticipated by anyone. Somewhere during the long, complex construction of the telescope on the ground, a microscopic, devastating mathematical error had been accidentally introduced. When you build a massive telescope, Whether it is constructed with giant mirrors or thick lenses, you first have to pay incredibly close attention to the exact geometric shape of the glass. The glass surface absolutely has to be polished exquisitely well. Tragically, the primary mirror of Hubble had been incorrectly polished just a little too flat. The vital curvature of the massive glass was mathematically off by exactly 1/50th of the tiny width of a single human hair. In the year 1993, after enduring extensive ground testing and running countless virtual simulations of the highly dangerous repair, the brave crew of the Space Shuttle Endeavour was sent directly into the deadly void to physically modify the massive telescope. The highly trained astronauts bravely performed 5 incredibly dangerous spacewalks over a period of 10 grueling days. It was far too physically difficult and dangerous to attempt to actually replace the giant main mirror in the vacuum of space. But because the brilliant engineers back on the ground mathematically knew exactly how mathematically wrong the giant mirror was, they were cleverly able to completely counteract that specific error. The best visual analogy is that the brave astronauts basically put a giant pair of corrective eyeglasses perfectly over all the complex instruments to perfectly compensate for the tiny error in the glass. On a cold day on January 13th in the year 1994, the space agency proudly announced to the entire waiting world that the newly installed corrective optics were flawlessly working. Once the giant Hubble Space Telescope was finally mechanically fixed, then it truly started to rapidly deliver absolutely amazing paradigm-shifting science. The clear images that Hubble instantly started returning to the Earth were just profoundly striking to the human eye. We were finally able to clearly see intricate visual detail in these incredibly distant spiral galaxies that had absolutely never before been optically possible. We saw glowing layers of expelled atmosphere that dying stars had violently expelled maybe 10,000 years ago, and that now formed very intricate ghostly shapes in the dark. Hubble also beautifully showed us incredibly detailed visions of familiar objects sitting right in our own local solar system that had only been previously possible to see with physical space, probes physically flying past them, like the famous Voyager probes. We were finally able to see for the very first time the beautifully changing visual effect of passing seasons directly on the red surface of Mars. We watched the way that the white polar ice caps naturally grew and visually shrank with the passing months. Just clearly seeing these dynamic scenes made the cold universe somehow feel much more familiar and Earth-like. It truly became exactly like doing beautiful landscape photography, but on a massive cosmic scale. Over its long, heroic lifetime, the Hubble machine produced some of our absolute most spectacular and deeply iconic images of the cosmos. It gave us the towering, glowing clouds of the pillars of creation, all the way to the absolute sharpest ever visual view of the entire Andromeda galaxy. And then it captured perhaps the single most important, philosophically profound photograph in all of astronomical history. On a quiet day on December 18th in the year 1995, the Space Telescope quietly began a bold 10-day mission, broadly known as the Hubble Deep Field. By intentionally staring at an apparent completely empty void located near the constellation of Ursa Major, the engineers were taking the absolute most powerful telescope of the modern time and allowing it to simply stare blindly at what was otherwise an apparently completely empty, black patch of the sky for as long as we possibly could keep it pointed there. Whereas most traditional astronomical sky surveys were deeply concerned with rapidly capturing the full, wide breadth of the visible sky, Hubble intensely focused its gaze on a single, tiny, dark location that would mathematically not be visually obstructed by the planet as the telescope continuously circled the Earth. The exact physical size of the Hubble Deep Field is roughly about the size of a tiny coin. So if you hold up a small metal coin directly to the night sky at arm length, that tiny blocked area is about the exact size of the deep field observation. And what was actually hiding there in the dark was absolutely, profoundly astounding. The resulting compiled image brilliantly revealed almost 3,000 individual galaxies. These were highly sharp images of giant galaxies you could previously only dream to have ever seen on a chemical photograph, and it revealed just an absolute plethora of completely different galactic sizes, violent shapes, glowing colours, and ancient ages. We clearly do see other familiar spiral galaxies rotating exactly like our Milky Way, but we also incredibly see these giant, bloated, red, elliptical galaxies. We also capture terrifying images of massive galaxies that are caught directly in the violent middle of physically colliding and destroying each other. It is absolutely not just a pretty picture to hang on a wall. It actively reveals deep fundamental truths that professional astronomers simply did not know about the evolutionary nature of the early universe. Each specific galaxy captured in the deep field image resides at a completely different point in deep time. When we optically observe massive galaxies resting at further and further physical distances away from us, what we are actually physically seeing is the ancient light that violently left those blazing galaxies millions, or indeed many billions, of years ago in the deep past. The absolute most distant red smudges are shown exactly as they physically were over 12 billion years in the deep past, near the dawn of creation. Hubble effectively provided us a profound cosmic time capsule perfectly contained in a single, brilliantly compiled image. The brilliant engineers successfully turned Hubble from a humiliating potential failure into what is generally considered today the absolute most incredible, productive scientific instrument that humanity has ever known to this current time. The telescope inherently had a few delicate instruments initially that naturally did a really good job at first, but then as global technology rapidly evolved, we were eventually able to physically retrofit the aging telescope with even better, far more sensitive modern instruments. Hubble bravely embarked on even further deep field survey missions, peering even farther into the dark cosmos, with newly updated, highly sensitive cameras explicitly providing deep surveys in both the ultraviolet and the long-infrared invisible light. Looking out at this image filled with an almost infinite, chaotic sea of ancient galaxies, dedicated scientists deeply hope that somewhere out there in the dark there lies a living world exactly like our own blue planet. We are nearing the final chapter of our cosmic journey. If you have made it this far, please consider leaving a comment and subscribing to This Is Space. Let us continue exploring the deepest mysteries of the universe together. In the dark days of the 16th century, an incredibly brave Italian friar named Giordano Bruno radically expanded the heliocentric notion of the known cosmos. Giordano brilliantly thought that the tiny glowing stars in the sky were really incredibly far away solar systems of their own. He believed they were massive blazing stars exactly like the Sun that would naturally be endlessly orbited by their own rocky planets, and on which there might quite possibly be living life. Tragically, for daring to speak this beautiful truth, Bruno was brutally deemed a religious heretic and terribly burned at the stake by the ruthless Roman Inquisition. But the glorious, expanding notion of distant exoplanets and the hope of finding alien life upon them absolutely did not die with him in the flames. One of the absolute most important, deeply philosophical questions for humanity to ever answer, of course, is whether we are truly alone in the cold universe. And that burning question is exactly why modern astronomers are so incredibly actively looking for hidden exoplanets in the dark. In the year 1992, dedicated astronomers utilized the massive Arecibo radio telescope dish located in Puerto Rico to carefully observe a rapidly spinning pulsar located well over 2,000 light-years away from the planet Earth. A pulsar is a really incredibly weird, highly violent type of a dead star. It is really just the crushed, highly radioactive remnants of an incredibly old, massive star that has violently gone supernova and exploded. Its crushed core has physically collapsed down into a very, very small, unimaginably dense dead star, and this terrifying object is spinning wildly around very, very rapidly, sometimes spinning violently more than 1,000 complete times every single second, and constantly beaming out a deadly sweeping lighthouse beam of intense radiation. But their particular cosmic lighthouse spinning in the dark had some incredibly mysterious irregularities in its strict timing. Some massive physical object was floating close enough to regularly exert a very noticeable gravitational pulling effect on its highly precise timing. It remarkably turned out that it was not just one rocky planet floating in the radiation, but as many as 3 completely dead, irradiated planets that were constantly orbiting the dead pulsar, and their specific orbital periods were brilliantly able to be mathematically inferred perfectly from those highly precise timing measurements. The very first alien worlds located completely beyond our local solar system had finally been found by humanity. Then, in the year 1995, a highly dedicated pair of Swiss astronomers were carefully watching not the dead core of an exploded star, but a perfectly normal, stable star very, very similar to our own blazing sun. The star was called 51 Pegasi, located just slightly over 50 light-years away from the planet Earth. Its visible light was periodically, rhythmically getting slightly redder to the eye, then predictably shifting bluer. It was also physically wobbling slightly back and forth in empty space. The subtle movement was definitively caused by a smaller, unseen massive body locked in a tight orbit. While we might absolutely not be able to visually detect the actual physical presence of the dark planet directly with our cameras, we can easily detect their massive gravitational pulling influence acting upon their massive parent star. The hidden planet was mathematically calculated to be roughly about half the total physical mass of the giant Jupiter, but it orbited so incredibly close to its blazing star that its entire orbital year lasted less than 5 single Earth days. Many of the strange alien solar systems we currently find have got these bizarre, terrifying objects known as hot Jupiters. They are massive, boiling gas giant planets, which endlessly orbit very, very close to their violently hot parent stars. They are simply the easiest massive ones for our telescopes to quickly find because they naturally have the absolute biggest gravitational effect on the wobble of their parent star, and so they tend to logically be the exact ones you manage to find first in any sky survey. As the brand new millennium peacefully dawned, an entirely fresh, exciting field in modern astronomy beautifully flourished. There have been some absolutely amazing historic discoveries of bizarre extrasolar planets, heavily including huge, sprawling, chaotic alien solar systems, and a vast lot of the strange planets that we are actively finding are very physically big and orbit very, very terrifyingly close to the hot stars. So these are massive, enormous, boiling, sort of Jupiter-plus planets, but floating completely within the tight orbit of a tiny Mercury. They beautifully come in all completely different geometric shapes and massive sizes. There are highly bizarre planets that simply do not bear any familiar resemblance to the specific, organized distribution of our own quiet solar system necessarily. We are actively finding weird exoplanets constantly orbiting around chaotic binary star systems with 2 suns, and we are also regularly finding completely different sizes of rocky planets around highly unstable stars. We have remarkably even discovered dark, freezing orphan planets. These are incredibly sad, lonely planets that simply do not have a warm star to safely orbit. Where did these dark wanderers even come from? Are they massive rocky things that have been violently shot out of an unstable, chaotic solar system by a massive gravity slingshot? Or are they strange things that just naturally formed alone in the freezing, deep space? Some of these bizarre worlds we have incredibly even seen directly through our massive infrared telescopes, while actively picking up their faint thermal heat sources as they desperately dance around their distant star. But despite all these incredible, groundbreaking cosmic observations across the galaxy, the blue planet Earth absolutely remains completely, incredibly special. It is remarkably easy to quickly say we are completely unique. Sitting here with a beautiful blue planet, we have got all this wonderful liquid water. We have the absolute most complex biological life that we are actively aware of so far in the void. But we do not really know the absolute truth. Our current scientific sample of the countless other rocky planets is actually pretty tiny and heavily biased. The vast universe is generally a largely inhospitable, highly deadly place filled with radiation and freezing cold. The absolute holy grail for many dedicated planet hunters is the eventual verified discovery of another rocky world with the perfect potential to successfully support biological life exactly as we know it. Astronomers are really incredibly excited about the hopeful idea of finally finding other blue Earths hidden in the deep universe. We mathematically believe they must absolutely exist out there. Habitable zones are the specific mathematical orbital distances from a given burning star where liquid water, which is an absolutely key fundamental ingredient to biological life, exactly as we understand it, can theoretically exist peacefully upon the rocky surface of an Earth-like stable world. Eagerly joining the grand cosmic quest in the year 2009, the incredibly advanced Kepler Space Telescope heavily led the brave charge to actively discover tiny, Earth-sized rocky exoplanets sitting perfectly within the gentle habitable zone around their distant stars. If we are to eventually find complex biological life anywhere else floating in the cold universe, apart from the Earth, finding a planet having vast oceans of liquid water is probably a really good, logical place to actively start looking. But the specific, safe, habitable zone is absolutely not the exact same distance for every single burning star. The much more incredibly massive the star is, the much brighter and far hotter it violently burns in the dark. So the rocky planet must naturally orbit much farther away into the cold void in order to successfully retain liquid water without it instantly boiling away into steam. The SOLE, highly sensitive scientific instrument attached to Kepler, was a brilliant photometer that carefully continually monitored the exact baseline brightness of approximately 150,000 different main sequence stars at the exact same time. Incredibly tiny but highly periodic measurable drops in the observed brightness indicate that a tiny dark planet is momentarily silently blocking a very small portion of the light of the star from reaching the lens. The rocky world known as Kepler 186f was the very first truly Earth-sized rocky planet successfully found perfectly within the habitable zone. Located over 500 light-years away from the planet Earth, safely in the direction of the constellation Cygnus, the distant rocky world silently orbits a dim red dwarf star. If we are actively looking for rocky planets that might potentially harbour complex biological life, we really desperately want them to be safely orbiting around a highly stable, yellow star exactly like our Sun. A massive lot of the rocky planets that have recently been found are violently orbiting around chaotic red dwarf stars. Now, those specific stars are very physically unstable. They are very visually faint most of the time, but then they frequently have huge, highly violent eruptions of deadly radiation, which would probably instantly kill any fragile biological life forms trying to survive on the rocky surface. As of the year 2020, there are well over 4,000 scientifically confirmed verified exoplanets known to humanity. Over half of those confirmed alien worlds were directly discovered hiding in the massive data from Kepler. We have remarkably discovered thousands upon thousands of strange alien planets, constantly orbiting around the glowing stars situated in the local region around our Sun. But this impressive number is truly only a tiny drop of water in the massive, infinite cosmic ocean. There is absolutely no physical rule of gravity that dictates planets absolutely have to be orbiting exactly in the exact same flat visual plane that we are looking from. If the Kepler machine is able to, purely by random geometric chance, detect thousands of tiny exoplanets which just simply happen to be perfectly passing directly in front of a distant star from our specific line of sight, we can then mathematically step back and realize the stunning truth. There are highly likely to be tens, if not hundreds, of trillions of unseen rocky planets floating just inside the swirling arms of the Milky Way galaxy alone. And then, if you deeply think of all the countless trillions of other massive galaxies floating in the universe, there would just be an absolutely unimaginable, terrifying number of planets out there in the dark, possessing an absolutely incredible, endless array of biological possibilities. Kepler successfully ended its historic noble mission in November of the year 2018, but the heavy baton of cosmic discovery has been smoothly passed to entirely other advanced observatories, built both completely around the world and floating silently in deep space. I deeply think as we constantly discover more terrifying and beautiful facts about the cosmos, we naturally become much smaller and far less physically significant in the grand scheme. But our true philosophical significance absolutely remains for a highly important reason, and that is fundamentally because we are still, currently, the only self-aware biological life forms known to exist in the entire vast universe, living perfectly right here on the fragile blue planet Earth. The incredible evolving suite of humanity's advanced telescopes, ranging from the dusty ground to high in orbit, have completely opened up the ancient cosmic history books for us to read. Hubble beautifully brought us incredibly close to the fiery inception of our universe, but to go ever further backward in deep time, humanity relentlessly continues to advance our complex telescope technology. The ultimate grand successor of Hubble is the absolute most incredibly complex and vastly largest space telescope constructed to date. Named after the dedicated man who proudly headed the space agency in the 1960s, the James Webb Space Telescope is an engineering marvel. It is the absolute biggest, most complex telescope we have ever dared to put into the freezing vacuum of space, and it uniquely possesses an absolutely unprecedented magical capability to peer deeply into the freezing dark of the early universe. It can look with incredibly great sharp resolution at exactly what the chaotic early galaxies actually looked like, resting in the dark dawn of the early universe. Its 18 glowing gold-plated hexagonal mirrors mechanically combine to flawlessly stretch a massive 6.5 meters across the dark vacuum. So, it represents a highly significant, massive geometric increase in total light collecting aperture, and it is going to perfectly be able to look much, much deeper and far further backward in the universe than anything before it. At the absolute towering height of the power of Hubble, it could only look backward to roughly 1/10 of the total age of the universe. But that was simply not far enough backward to actually visually witness the fiery, chaotic births of the very, very first primitive galaxies. The James Webb machine actively aims to carefully look at the very first burning galaxies forming in the primordial dark of the universe. We completely do not know exactly what they are going to physically look like. We absolutely do not know what specific type of ancient gas they are violently forming from. Unlike the aging Hubble machine, which originally heavily studied standard visible light, the James Webb Telescope actively performs almost entirely deep infrared thermal observations. It will also clearly see exactly how massive, terrifying black holes lurking in the early universe actively accrete surrounding matter and physically grow in mass. We currently know as a fact that we have terrifyingly massive black holes existing just 1 billion years after the fiery Big Bang, which already impossibly have the staggering physical mass of 20 or 30 billion of our blazing suns. We completely do not currently know how to physically make them grow in such an incredibly short amount of cosmological time. The massive James Webb Space Telescope silently operates completely outside the orbit of the Earth, resting 1.5 million kilometers far away from the blue planet. That is roughly 4 complete times the vast physical distance of the glowing moon. There are some incredibly, very interesting, highly stable gravitational points floating in empty space, mathematically called Lagrange points. Lagrange points are essentially a perfect gravitational balance directly between the massive pulling forces of multiple giant space objects. Webb silently orbits the blazing sun, but miraculously remains in a highly fixed, completely stable spot directly in relation to the moving Earth. And it is entirely possible to safely locate a delicate spacecraft perfectly there, so that they are continuously always comfortably sitting at the exact same relative physical location relative to the Earth and the pulling sun. The telescope is absolutely never going to visually see the blue Earth. It is absolutely never going to directly see the blazing sun. It is strictly always going to be intensely looking outward into the freezing dark. It is going to be continuously scanning completely different, unexplored areas of the deep sky. It is looking exactly where we desperately want it to look, pointing far away from the local stuff we already know and staring deep out into the mysterious ancient universe. There, its massive 5-layer protective solar heat shield, which is roughly the immense physical size of a giant tennis court, completely blocks the blinding light and intense thermal heat from the blazing sun, the Earth, and the glowing moon. It also miraculously blocks the internal heat radiating from the warm spacecraft itself, perfectly enabling Webb to smoothly obtain the absolute deepest, most sensitive, freezing cold thermal observations to ever date. Looking forward into the unwritten future, we absolutely should carefully prepare our minds for significantly more massive, shocking surprises. In 10 short years, we will inevitably have a completely different paradigm-shifting take on exactly how mind-bendingly big the actual universe really is, and it just constantly keeps getting bigger and bigger out there in the freezing dark. By carefully and brilliantly manipulating travelling light, we have successfully revealed the hidden mechanics of the heavens, the magnificent invention of the simple glass telescope, and then its subsequent relentless mechanical improvement. Absolutely completely turned our basic understanding of the entire natural world directly on its head. Humanity endlessly continues the noble, philosophical search for our exact, true place hidden in the vast cosmos. 20 short years ago, we truthfully only knew of exactly one single solar system that possessed rocky planets, which was our own. Now, we scientifically know of many thousands of strange alien worlds floating in the dark. It is absolutely amazing. Centuries of relentless cosmic discovery have utterly challenged our deeply held, comforting preconceptions. The truly wonderful, beautiful thing about the scientific method, and particularly studying the deep cosmos, is that our limited perception is continually beautifully changing with new data. Our brand new, highly advanced generation of giant telescopes will undoubtedly reveal even more terrifying and beautiful secrets. It is incredibly important that we relentlessly keep pushing the absolute boundaries of our engineering, so that we absolutely never become intellectually complacent, and that we absolutely never scientifically stagnate in the dark. We are constantly, beautifully challenged by the incredible things we discover and the massive, impossible things we bravely attempt to build. Thank you for watching. This is Space. Please leave a final comment below with your thoughts on our journey, and subscribe to join us next time as we continue to explore the endless wonders of the universe.